The topic is Sri Ramakrishna's miracle, Swami Adbhutananda. Swami Adbhutananda is the only direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna who was uneducated. Not only uneducated in the sense of having no school education, he was completely unlettered. He had that distinction among Sri Ramakrishna's direct disciples. Now, Sri Ramakrishna himself is often falsely accused of being illiterate. He wasn't. He knew how to read and write. But he chose not to pursue that. He didn't want a breadwinning education, he knew, at 7 years old. He wanted that education which would solve the problem of life and death. And he was an early dropout, you say. But he can't be accused of being illiterate. So, seeing the situation, he had this Bihari disciple and servant boy that was there at Dakshineshwar. And he said, well, this won't do. I'll have to teach him a little, to educate him a little bit. So they got the Bengali alphabet. They started with the first letter. What's the first letter of the Bengali alphabet?
Oh, Ka. Ka is the
yes, yes.
Consonant.
Yeah. So Sri Ramakrishna says, repeat after me, Ka. 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 He had a different accent, you know. And he was full of prana. I mean, his whole system was full of prana. His ideal was Rama, and he was Rama's servant, Hanuman, and Hanuman was strong, and he worked out with the wrestlers and lifted weights, and with all his prana, he pronounced it wrong. So this went on for 3 days, and each lesson would end with both of them laughing hysterically because it was so pathetically bad. But they were so detached that they could see it from that detached, oh, this is terrible, and they'd laugh about it. Let's try again tomorrow. So after 3 days, not getting past the first letter of the Bengali alphabet, Ramakrishna says, well, that's enough. Now, if God incarnate can't teach you the Bengali alphabet, there's some reason for your not knowing it. That's your role. That's his role, was not to know, have any formal education. But being completely unlettered did not impair Swami Adbhutananda's ability to serve his spiritual master, Sri Ramakrishna, or to learn the highest spiritual truth. Swami Adbhutananda experienced Nirvikalpa Samadhi at least twice in his life. We know that because he told his students that he did. But we don't know that that's all the experience. There may be other times when he didn't express that. We don't know. And it's not that this was something that was open to everyone, not even Sri Ramakrishna's direct disciples, that they should all have Nirvikalpa Samadhi. When I was in India, Swami Bhajanananda listed 5 that he could determine definitely had Nirvikalpa Samadhi based on whatever evidence he could gather. And he was still working on it at the time. I don't know what he says now. But Latu Maharaj was one of those. In his mature years, people of all walks of life came to him for spiritual inspiration, advice, and counsel. Simple people from the lower classes of society felt a special attraction. Here was a holy man with whom they felt no barrier or awe in his presence. Swami Adbhutananda made them his own. They'd go to Bellarmine, they'd bow down to Swami Shivananda or Swami Premananda, and then they'd run to Swami Latu Maharaj, to Latu Maharaj, Swami Adbhutananda. Long after the Master's passing, in 1889 or 1900, Swami Adbhutananda was staying at the Basumati Printing Company, owned by one of Ramakrishna's householder disciples, Upendranath Mukherjee. So he would spread his blanket on the wooden crates that hold the paper and meditate at night as the presses run. The noise didn't bother him. Swami Adbhutananda was criticized for associating with the pressmen, who were known to drink and gamble, etc., etc. You shouldn't associate with them. They're not good people. When challenged about it, and they'd list all the reasons that they weren't good people, and Latu Maharaj, that's how he was affectionately known in the order, Latu Maharaj, would listen, he'd give them ear, he'd let them vent, and his answer is very instructive. They're not hypocrites. Notice, he doesn't waste a single word. They're not hypocrites. Now, he's not saying you are hypocrites. He's saying they're not hypocrites. So he judged people by their transparency, their sincerity, their purity. It wasn't how society judged people. They're not hypocrites. They may do all the... There's a difference between being good and being goody-goody. You see? One can know how a good person should act and act that way, but not deal with what's going on inside, even though it's not showing. See? He wasn't... Swami Adbhutananda wasn't interested in that kind of devotee. He was interested in people that were sincere and transparent, could see their faults, could admit their faults. Swami Vivekananda says, take a person from where they stand and from there give them a lift. Well, you can't... The teacher has a very hard time taking a person from where they stand if the person themselves doesn't know where they stand. It's an essential starting point, and it doesn't matter where we are. What matters is our transparency and our aspiration. It doesn't matter where we start. We can start from the lowest point. But if we just see ourselves clearly, admit, okay, this is where I am, I don't want to be here, but this holy man says, I don't have to be here, I'm getting out of here. You know, that's how it works. And that's how he expressed it. He didn't mince words. They're not hypocrites. He'll say it, and then you do the commentary. You see? Or they'll poke him. Sometimes his students would poke him. He showed his affection and sympathy to simple, unostentatious people, regardless of their station in life. Sophisticated, successful people came to him, judges, businessmen, etc. One of them, Chandrasekhar Chattopadhyay, wrote an extensive biography in 1940, 20 years after Swami Adbhutananda's passing. It's called Swami Adbhutananda as we saw him in English, and runs about 450 pages. I want to quote from, we owe him a great debt of gratitude for putting these things in some kind of permanent form. I want to quote from Mr. Chatterjee so that you can get a sense from one of his devotees, not disciples, he didn't formally initiate, from one of his devotees, what Swami Adbhutananda was like in his later years, when he wasn't so totally focused on his own spiritual disciplines that he could interact with people. There was a block in his life when he really couldn't interact with people because he was so focused on his austerities and disciplines that he had a hard time eating and sleeping. We'll get to that later. But the intensity of his aspiration was awesome. But later on, when he was available to people, he was completely available to them. And this is how they expressed it. He didn't formally initiate, but he taught a great deal. So this is Chandrasekhar. Whether in Kashi or Calcutta, whenever a complex religious or spiritual problem was raised, Latu Maharaj would make it crystal clear in his simple half-patois language. Well, he spoke in a mixture of his native dialect of the Chapra district of Bihar, which was a sort of an uneducated Hindi, and an ungrammatical Bengali, sort of a combination of those two things. In his simple half-patois language, sometimes such words and expression would come from his lips, which in their verbal beauty, cadence, and import would startle us. His face and body would be aglow with enthusiasm that used to keep his listeners spellbound. What was still more striking was a flow of thought that appeared to be unending. Garbed in simple language would come out thoughts which were the combined result of deep thinking, wide experience, and direct realization, a rare combination of heaven and earth. Whatever he said had the impress of power and wisdom running through which there would always be found a deep universal love and an endeavor to take each and all towards the final goal of life, God realization. As we would listen to him, our minds, unbeknownst to ourselves, would soar higher to an unknown region of peace and bliss, far above the trials and tribulations of this world of ours. The glow of his smile that used to illumine his face during those talks is still a loving treasure in our hearts. Hiding his deep spiritual knowledge under the guise of illiteracy, knowledge born of the divine grace of his guru and worked up through his own tireless austerities even to the end of his life, he used to give fullest satisfaction to seekers of truth and seekers of God with form. Himself suffused with an angelic love, he used to mellow our lives with its nectar. Fault-finding was foreign to him. He wore a particular magnifying glass to see others' virtue. A drop of virtue appeared to him as an ocean, and he could not bear any discussion about other people's defects in his presence. To criticize others within his hearing was not possible. One day, seeing this fault in the character of the present author, Swami Adbhutananda said, "It is only impure people who see faults and impurities in others. To the pure ones, another's virtues appear in glowing colors. You people do not have eyes to see virtues. You have learnt only one lesson, to find others' faults. This jealousy is retarding your spiritual progress. Inside you is jealousy, malice. Outside you wear a religious mark. And you hold a rosary in your hand. Of what help will that be?" The author continues, "One may observe in this remark his strong whip hand, but how much love and sympathy and goodwill was hidden, people did not know. Only those who tasted the strength of the whip hand had the luck of tasting the love that moved the hand." So, it's beautiful. Latu Maharaj had two ways of imparting instructions: indirectly through jokes and jibes, and directly through scolding. Indiscriminate imitation of others, which he used to say, call copy in English, in Little English. Idling away one's time, harming others. Against these faults he used the direct method. His pointed, forceful words, where they gushed from at such times we don't know, acted on our hearts like bayonet jabs. But instead of drooping, our spirit used to be roused up, our latent powers emboldened, to enable us to overcome those very defects. We were roused to a new consciousness and determined to lead a nobler life. All these sharp reproofs had but one aim. That was our spiritual advancement. Therefore, they were so sweet and loving. Swami Brahmananda said, "Why are you afraid," counseling a devotee, "to go to Latu Maharaj? How many sadhus can you find? So austere, so strict in observing the guiding principles of the sadhu's life. Yes, he has kept up a rough exterior, but that is to avoid a crowd. Inside him, it is all mercy and kindness. If you mix with him for just a few days, you will find him free of egoism, even free of the egoism of a sadhu. It is due to great merits in previous births that a person gets the company of such a sadhu. Is even the free from egoism, even that of a sadhu. You see, when you renounce the world, when you become a sadhu, you have to switch gears. You know, I'm not this person from this family, I'm a child of God. My relatives are the devotees and my monastic brothers or monastic sisters. And this switch in the ego is difficult for many people. I mean, that's hard enough. But then once you make that shift and you immerse yourself in spiritual disciplines and you try to realize God and you dedicate your life to that, then you have to get rid of that ego that I'm a monastic. Because that's an obstacle to the final realization. So he doesn't even have the ego that he's a sadhu. He's lost that. You see? Now, Sri Ramakrishna, here's what the difference is like. There's an order of monks that Todapuri belonged to that are non-dualists. And they're pure spirit. So pure spirit doesn't need all these bodily comforts. Pure spirit doesn't even need clothes. So Sri Ramakrishna called Todapuri Nangda, to be the naked one, clothed in spirit. But they do it. They do that. That's part of their sadhana. That's part of their monastic discipline. They do that. When Sri Ramakrishna danced around, his clothes fell off. His clothes fell off because he lost consciousness of his body. He wasn't aware that he had a dhoti or that he had a body. He was so immersed in being pure spirit that all those things fell away of themselves. He didn't make a conscious effort to do it. That's kind of like what Latu Maharaj was with his monastic ego. It just fell off of him. All those austerities burned it away. Swamiji's brother, Mahendranath Datta, said, "In the personality of Latu there dwelt a superabundance of power, acquired through hard spiritual practice. It is this power which manifested itself in various ways, in lucid explanation of the deepest spiritual truths. The seekers of truth were simply charmed at this. Philosophers and scholars bowed their heads down to this power. So this is the miracle, you see. You take someone who shouldn't be able to even speak with philosophers and these top people in society, and he speaks with them, and they bow their heads to the power of his knowledge. The Maharaj of Khetri thought he was highly educated. Swami Vivekananda took Latu Maharaj. He loved to take Latu Maharaj with him, wherever he went. It was his joy, you see. This simple, guileless brother of his. And it's very interesting. When Vivekananda came back from the West the first time, they threw all these parties and everyone came to see him. Latu Maharaj was nowhere to be seen. They had this big gathering for him, and thousands of people came, and his brother disciples were all with him except Latu Maharaj. Latu Maharaj was somewhere out in the crowd. And Swamiji was looking for him and asking for him. Finally, he found him. Latu, where were you? Everyone else came. Oh, he said, Brother Lauren, he says, I just wanted to see if you still remembered me after you'd become spoiled by having so many Western disciples and all this adulation. I just wanted to see. And Swamiji embraced him and talked to him. He says, I'm your brother Lauren, and you're my brother Latu, and nothing has changed. Okay. See, but he always tested his brothers that way. When Sarat Maharaj came back from the West, he was very highly educated. He was the most educated. I think he had a master's degree and he was studying for his medical degree. And he was very tip-top. He was a perfect person for the West, with all our rules and regulations and formalities. And he came back and, he kept his room just right and his bedding just right. And Latu Maharaj would come into Sarat Maharaj's room when he was away. And he'd come in with his muddy feet and he'd just kind of grind him off on his bedding. He'd get on his bed, put his feet up and just rub them against each other and make a big mess. And Sarat found him doing this, or found out that he says, brother, what are you doing? He said, I just want to see if the West has spoiled you. And Sarat Maharaj laughs and grabs him and hugs him, like that. And then, he quit doing it. But, he was so simple. He wouldn't find out these things by discussion. He'd just do an experiment. Let's see how he reacts. Will he get mad? He'd find out in a very direct way. He didn't cogitate much about these things or depend on a verbal understanding. He'd just perform his experiment and then see what happened. Swami Adbhutananda was born in an impoverished to an impoverished shepherd and his wife in the Chhapra district of Bihar, north of the present West Bengal and south of and bordering Nepal. His first name was Rakturam, meaning, O Lord Rama, protect this child. His parents were evidently worshippers of Lord Rama. This name is given to a boy whose elder brothers die in infancy. We don't know his last name. Rakturam's parents died before he was 5, and he was left in the care of a childless uncle who was better off financially and loved the boy. Although he earned well, the uncle seems to have spent better. Running into debt, he had to sell off his house to all the creditors and leave the village. Now, as long as Raktu, now they've said his name was Rakturam, and now he's Raktu, and he's Swami Adbhutananda, and he's Latu. So he's got a lot of names. So in order to avoid confusion, let's go through the names. Okay, Rakturam, Raktu, Latu, Latu Maharaj, Laltu, Leto, Nato, and Plato. Swami Vivekananda would call him Plato when he came out with these startlingly original observations and deep philosophical insights. So Vivekananda would call him our Plato. And of course, Swami Adbhutananda. And that name was practically never used during his life. As long as Raktu was with his uncle in the village, he remained a carefree boy, roaming about in the fields and pastures in the company of the shepherd boys, sometimes chasing the cattle, sometimes playing with the shepherd boys. Raktu, however, would be missing very often. After anxious searches, he would be found in some neighboring village, perhaps far away from his own. Of course, he had to grin and bear the scoldings stoically. Soon, however, his uncle came to understand the scolding or even beating would have no effect on this boy, who would have his own way, come what may. Moreover, love played its part. The uncle's loving heart left Raktu a free boy. Now, these were lifelong characteristics. He had an extraordinarily strong will. He wasn't moved by force, but he could be moved by love. This will run through his whole life. Latsu Maharaj was very reticent about himself. What we know of his childhood slipped out unawares in the course of conversation. He said, "Do you know, I used to move freely with the boys tending cattle. How guileless and unsophisticated they were. You can't get real joy unless you be like one of them." This is the key to unlock his childhood. He learnt life's lessons in the school of nature in the company of those guileless shepherds. His well-knit, short-statured body followed his mind freely, enjoying the beauty, grace, and fragrance of the nature surrounding him. He had not the ill luck to enter the precincts of the village primary school. Nature provided his schooling. Now, and later on, expressing sympathy for a man who had to relocate because of financial difficulties, he said, "Dear one, does one like to leave one's hearth and home? I myself shed tears when I came to Calcutta. You have your friends and relatives. I had none. Still, I felt so much remorse. It is but natural that you feel it so keenly." Very touching. So, the uncle and the boy migrated to Calcutta looking for work. They had a friend from the village who worked at the State Medical College in Calcutta. The uncle found work for Rakturam as a servant in the home of one of the professors, Ramchandra Datta. This marked a new beginning for Rakturam. We don't know how old he was when he came to Calcutta, or how long he worked for Ramchandra before meeting Sri Ramakrishna in 1879 or early 1880. I want to talk a little bit about his life as a servant with Ramchandra Datta. Now, as you know, Ramchandra Datta was a cousin, not a close cousin, but a distant cousin of Narendranath Datta, who became Vivekananda. He was a medical doctor, he was a chemist, he was a pharmacologist, he was a teacher at Calcutta Medical College, and held the position of chemical examiner in the English government. He was a member of the Chemical Association of England at that time. He was a prominent self-made man. He had extracted the active ingredient from a medicinal plant that was approved by the government of India as a remedy for blood dysentery. So the household was known as a very loving, open household. noted for the affectionate nature of its members. Raktu found the atmosphere very congenial to the development of his character. Ramchandra himself was a man of excellent character. He was himself prompt and ever ready to carry out the orders of his superiors, and he expected the same of his subordinates. He had possessed a penetrating intellect which unmasked the pride and hypocrisy underlying the verbal modesty and humility. Whatever he found to be have the true ring of the heart, whenever he found something that was true and noble, it had his heart's devotion. But he was a tough sell, and he was agnostic when Latu Maharaj went to work for him. It was expected that Raktu would develop into a lad of active habits, obedient, honest, and dutiful. Nor did it take long for the family to notice those qualities in their new servant, who came to be called endearingly Laltu. Here we go. In the new master's house, Laltu was to do the chores for the lady of the house and the girls, to purchase greens and vegetables, to take the little kids for a walk, to bring the master's lunch to the office, and now and then to collect bills from shops, all of which he used to do with utmost alacrity. Besides, he had his personal liking for wrestling and bodybuilding. Some members of the household didn't look upon this hobby with a keen eye, but Ramchandra, his master, was generous in this regard. So he had a lot of freedom. It was a liberal household. One of the friends of Ramchandra suspected that the boy was pocketing money when he went out on errands and chores to collect the bills and so forth and buy things. So he called the boy aside and asked, "Tell me, lad, how much did you pocket today?" The insult was too much for the boy to swallow. He said, "Sir, I may be a servant, but know it that I am not a thief." This was considered impudent in those times. And the matter was brought to Ramchandra's attention. And he said, "Leave him alone," to his friend. Leave this boy alone. The boy's not a thief. Whatever he needs anything, he asks my wife and gets it. Laltu made a name in his master's house for his forthrightness. Unpleasant words would sometimes come out of his lips, as Laltu's rustic mind would not mince matters. Rama, however, appreciated the boy's outspokenness, though expressed in his kind of unsophisticated manner. Ramchandra would not pay any heed to the complaints against his favorite boy servant. But by this indirect encouragement, Laltu became all the more outspoken and severe in his criticism of others' lapses. Whenever he found deviation from truth or an attempt to cheat his master by flattery or by other means, Laltu's axe fell with sure effect. Again, from the pen of Mahendranath Datta. On all such occasions, Laltu used to take a peculiar stance. He took the pose of a wrestler, his stiff straight neck turned a little towards the object of his criticism, his chin little raised, his eyes wide open and blazing, shooting fire. The walls of his nostrils considerably swollen, fingers closely joined in a fist, his words gushing out in stutters of a half Bengali and half patois of the Chhapra district, would paralyze his target into complete silence. He was spirited, and he was blessed, to find shelter with Ramchandra, who allowed him to develop in a way that was quite natural for him. So in November 1879, Ramchandra met Sri Ramakrishna, and his life changed. And it was an immediate change. And from an agnostic, he became a devotee very quickly. And he'd come home and he'd tell everyone what he'd heard from Ramchandra or Sri Ramakrishna that day, and talk about it. And he couldn't contain his enthusiasm. And Latu was present, so he heard Sri Ramakrishna's instructions or his parables, and he would just take it as his own. He would take that instruction as his own. He accepted Sri Ramakrishna as his teacher before he even saw him, and he took it on his. He took those things as his instruction to such an extent that he would be found in some corner of the house, stretched out on his back, covered with a chudder, at odd times, and they thought that he was sleeping. And pull back the chudder, you'd see he was crying. Now, Ramchandra's wife thought that he was crying because he missed his home, that he was homesick. And she asked him about it. She's very sweet-natured. She didn't say, "What are you doing lying around like a log?" She wanted to know if he was homesick and what she could do about it. He didn't say anything. Oh, he's meditating. He did this his whole life long. He'd sit there like a log, like he was doing nothing, but he'd be intensely meditating. So this started very early. So this is his first meeting with Sri Ramakrishna. It's narrated first by Ramlal Chatterjee, Sri Ramakrishna's nephew, and then the narration is picked up by Ram Babu. Because after some time, Latu couldn't bear it anymore. He had to meet the master. And he just begged Ramchandra, "Please take me with you sometime. Please, when you have an opportunity, I want to meet him." So Ramlal says, "One day I saw Ram Babu brought a boy servant with him. He was short, strong, and stout. His appearance, though a little plump, was indicative of great strength. I did not know his name then. I saw the lad standing in the western veranda. Ram Babu was inside the room, perhaps in search of the master, who was outside the room. Sri Ramakrishna came to the veranda humming a tune in impersonation of Sri Radhika. Hearing him, Ram Babu came out, and by that time Sri Ramakrishna had reached the veranda. Seeing Ram, he said, 'Is it you? Who has brought this boy? Where did you get him?' 'I see the signs of a holy man.'" Saying these words, Sri Ramakrishna and Ram entered the room, but Laltu waited standing outside. I asked him to enter. He was thinking whether he would enter or not when Thakur himself called him in. I did not enter. So Ram Babu takes up the narrative. The moment I got up after bowing down to Sri Ramakrishna, I found Laltu catching hold of Sri Ramakrishna's feet, putting his head on them. Thakur started talking to me as if he did not take any note of the boy. Laltu, however, got up and stood in front of him with folded palms, all the while drinking in his words like nectar. Thakur, as usual, was smiling and talking, but now and then casting his eyes on the boy. He said, "Sit down. Why are you not sitting?" Our conversation, in the meantime, touched the topic of a category of jivas who are ever free and never come under the clutches of Maya, the Ishwar Koti. Thakur said, "These eternally free souls, through all their incarnations, never lose sight of their true nature, of their relationship with the Lord of the universe. They're like a spring whose mouth has been blocked by a stone. A mason seeking the mouth of the spring removes the stone, and immediately water gushes out beautifully. Saying this, Sri Ramakrishna all of a sudden touched Laltu. At once there was a tremendous welling up of emotion in the boy. He lost all consciousness of his body and the world outside. It seems he had been transported to an unknown region. All the hair of his body stood on end. His voice was broken and inarticulate. There was an incessant flow of tears down his cheeks. His lips were quivering violently. My mouth agape, this is Ram Babu, my mouth agape in wonder at this unprecedented surge of emotion in Laltu. I was simply paralyzed. Ram Babu was not someone to be easily paralyzed. When, however, I found Laltu went on crying in that state with no sign of abating, I came to myself. After all, this was his servant boy. I came to myself and interceded. Master, that is true, I have no doubt, but will he not stop crying? Sri Ramakrishna touched Laltu, and he became normal again. So, he's talking about the Ishvara Kodis, and then it's like a lecture demonstration. This is what it's like. Boom. Here's the description. Here's what it's like in real life. Now, does that mean that Swami Adbhutananda was an Ishvara Kodi? Sri Ramakrishna identified 5 of his disciples as Ishvara Kodis. Does this mean that Laltu was also an Ishvara Kodi? I think it's a little hard to say. Just because Sri Ramakrishna didn't nail it down and say this one is an Ishvara Kodi doesn't mean that they weren't. He never gave a list. Of my 16 monastic disciples, 5 are Ishvara Kodis, and this is their names, 1, 2, 3, 4. He didn't do it that way. It just came out, you see. So it could be. So, but we don't know. In any case, we don't need to know. Whether or not he was an Ishvara Kodi. I mean, it's really, these things are really beyond our comprehension without a certain level of realization and spiritual practice. So let's talk about his training under Sri Ramakrishna. When Lachu Maharaj came to serve the Master, this was 1880, but we don't know how old he was. I don't think he was a boy, though. They called him a servant boy, but the use of the term is a little different than we would say it now. For us, a boy is up until the age of 12, maybe. He was certainly over 12. Then he might have been over 20, we don't know. When Latu came to serve the Master, he was in his critical teens. It says here he was in his teens, a period of life when the surge of the emotions is extremely strong. He came from a class of society where morals were loose. Drinking was universal. Glasses passing from fathers' hands to sons, and vulgar words and deeds were not deemed to be so. It is no small matter for a boy coming from such society to turn his mind away from all temptation and pass his days at Dakshinaswara, scaling the heights of renunciation and austerity under the watchful eyes of the strict disciplinarian that Sri Ramakrishna was. His determination to rid himself of all weakness was so thorough that no austerity to him ever proved too difficult to go through, and no obstacle too hard to surmount. A word from Sri Ramakrishna promptly evoked a promise, turned out from the depth of his personality, and that promise stoically kept to his last breath. So I want to kind of talk about that. One-pointed kind of will, that extremely intense one-pointed will that was directed towards realization and obedience. He didn't have the luxury of reading books. His guide was what Sri Ramakrishna told him. and his own experience. And this is related to sleep. From his childhood, Latu was a heavy sleeper. Moreover, he was a wrestler, and he took strenuous physical exercise. As usual with wrestlers, sleeping long hours. When he came to serve the master, his work increased, and he used to fall asleep early in the evening. He still continued that wrestling mode. He went to Hanuman Singh's gym. Hanuman Singh was the wrestler who Sri Ramakrishna blessed, that he was the guardian of Dakshineswar. That's the Hanuman Singh. He had a gym. Naturally, he used to fall asleep early in the evening. The master noticed it and said, "What is this?" It's dusk. It's the mystic hour when day meets night, and you're sleeping. I've never seen a spiritual aspirant behaving in this manner. During these hours, you should lose yourself in the thought of God, and you sleeping. Get up, quick. These words woke Latu from sleep as one guilty of a great offense. His head hung in shame. He said, "Never will I sleep during these hours." This promise he kept to his last breath. In Varanagramad, Latu Maharaj had a serious attack of pneumonia, and Sarat Maharaj was nursing him. Being a medical student, Sarat Maharaj was following the physician's instructions strictly, and would not yield to Latu Maharaj's request to him to make him sit up during those evening hours when he told the master that he would always meditate. At this, Latu said, "Leave off your doctor's injunctions. What do they understand? It is my master's orders, and it shall be obeyed. Under all conditions. If you do not help me sit up, mind you, I shall have to take the help of Mahavirji." Sarat Maharaj had to leave the room for a few seconds. When he returned, he found Latu Maharaj sitting in his bed. "Brother, should you have done like this in this condition, with your body so sick? Should we not follow the advice of the doctor? Have we not heard the Master say that during illness one should be guided by the advice of doctors? And have we not seen the Master himself strictly following their advice when he was sick? Why then, brother, do you go against the doctor's instructions?" Latu Maharaj brushed this aside, saying, "I do not know arguments. It is his order, and it shall be obeyed." A similar incident happened at Varanasi during his last illness. No one could ever think that in such a physical condition, any human being could ever sit unaided. And this was what he actually did. So strong was his determination to follow the Master's orders to the letter. Unique was the Master, and wonderful his disciple. That's what Adbhuta means, wonderful. It refers to the nature of the Atman, but in his case it also refers to all these other characteristics. From what I could see from the written record, there was only one day in his life when he didn't follow these instructions, and that was the last day. It's another incident dealing with sleep. Latu fell asleep in the first quarter of the night. The Master not only woke him up, but rebuked him. "If in the very first quarter of the night you fall asleep, when will you meditate? It's not yet 9, and yet you sleep like a log. You should have meditated the whole night and not have known when day broke. Instead, your eyelids are heavy with sleep in these early hours of the night. Have you come here only to sleep?" Latu Maharaj later narrated, "Deep sorrow seized me. I felt like what a donkey I must be. Enjoying the company and the guidance of the Master, I was wasting my time sleeping. I splashed water on the eyes and face, walked briskly for some time on the bank of the Ganga. When the body got heated sufficiently, I returned and sat near the Master. But oh, the insistence of sleep. Again I dozed. Again I went for a walk. Thus did I fight sleep the whole night. The next night also, the struggle continued. It was indeed a hard struggle. I suffered a lot, even during the day. Continuously the battle raged on day and night." You see, the instructions were, you should have meditated the whole night and not have felt that the day, not have been aware that the day broke. Those are his instructions. After 2 years' hard struggle, Latu conquered sleep. In this sense, he could keep his body perfectly fit for meditation and prayer with as little sleep as he liked, and at any hour of the day he liked, he could sleep. Sleep at night, of course, was completely forsaken for life. Have you ever heard of anyone else in this world, present or past, that ever did that? I haven't. It's awesome. And that's literally what he would do. He passed the whole night sleeping. I mean, he passed the whole night meditating. And he didn't, you see, this is the thing. He didn't say, I'm going to do this. He didn't talk about it. He did it. And his brother disciples at Bharanagormat had no idea. When they got under the mosquito curtain, they all had the same mosquito curtain. They got under the mosquito curtain and it was time to sleep. He'd act like he was doing what they were, going to sleep. And when they were all asleep, when he could, since they were all asleep, he'd get up and he'd do his beads like this. And Sarat Maharaj would hear the sound, and then the sound would stop. He thought there was a mouse or something. And this went on for many nights, that he'd hear the click, 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 then it'd stop. Click, 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 stop. And one night he says, I got to find out what's going on. He lit a match, saw Latu sitting up.
He lit a match.
Yeah. So, he's really unique. He doesn't waste time talking about what he's doing or communicate. He does it. And it's just that the Master's orders, do it. And it's just hard to believe. But it's inspiring. It's inspiring at the same time. So I gave my sister a copy of, I thought this was just awesome when I first read it. Swami Chaitananda wrote a little book called Swami Adbhutananda Teachings and Reminiscences, and then we retitled it later, How a Shepherd Boy Became a Saint. A little better title. But when I found this section in that book, I thought, wow, I got to share this with my sister. And she said, well, I read that book up to the point where I got to that same point, and I thought, she said, that's just inhuman. I can't believe that. She put the book away. So he talks about Holy Mother. He had a very deep, abiding relationship with Holy Mother, but it wasn't something that was communicated readily. So this is the time at Dakshineswar. Golat Ma and other women disciples of the Master had not yet come to Dakshineswar. Holy Mother was passing her days all by herself. One day the master saw Latu meditating on the bank of the Ganges, motionless as a log. He called aloud and said, "Fool, little do you know that the object of your meditation is inside the Nahabad, and she's not getting any help kneading the dough for chapati." Latu flushed with embarrassment. The master had never before asked Latu to serve Mother. When he was asked unexpectedly to serve Mother, Latu regarded himself as blessed, and with quick steps appeared at the door of the Nahabad beside the master. The master addressed the Holy Mother. He said, "This boy is pure in heart. He will knead the dough, and he's also very strong. Roll the chapatis and do whatever chores you want him to." The master was taking the boy through the path of service. The boy Latu had already purified himself by 1881 so as to be able to serve the Mother. The master showed Latu that one who would tread the path of service should not only serve the master wholeheartedly, but devote himself to the service of the ones who were dear to the master also. Later, living in Varanasi, Latu Maharaj referred to this incident. He said, we cannot conceive of the difficulties Mother had to pass through in those days. In that tiny room, she passed months and years. She couldn't even stretch her legs out when she slept in that room. Nobody knew this. They didn't know her hardship. Most didn't know that she was there. When she took her bath in the Ganges, also no one knew. I have never seen anyone so seized with the passion for dispassion. How blessed am I that the Master took me to her, who made my life fruitful. To serve her, what could I do? On the contrary, what could I do to serve her? On the contrary, it was she who bound me down with love celestial. She had nothing to expect from me. I had nothing to give her. It was through her grace that we obtained her for a mother. See the poignancy of the expression. It's awesome. This was his daily life at Dakshineswar. Immediately after leaving the bed, he would see the Master and bow down to him. When he wasn't at Dakshineswar, he would draw a mental picture of the Master and bow down to it. Next, after finishing his wash, he would come to the concert tower to Holy Mother, bow down before her, and finish the chores for her, including carrying Ganges water. Having finished the first round of chores, Latu would go to Hanuman Singh's gymnasium for wrestling. Later, however, he stopped wrestling at the Master's orders and utilized that time in japa. Whenever he could snatch a little time in the midst of his work, he would be found walking or sitting alone in a quiet place and taking the Lord's name, or humming a line or two of a devotional song. Mind, pray to Sita and Rama, not for aught but the bare necessities, rice and water to quench hunger, and a piece of cloth to cover shame, but go on taking his name all the time. Or mind, Rama's name is the abode of bliss, go on taking it ceaselessly. When he had to go somewhere, this repetition of the Lord's name and the singing would continue as he went on the streets. His next work was to bring Ganges water for the master's bath and to rub oil on him. Having finished bathing the master, he would himself go to the Ganges for his own bath. Clad in a wet cloth, he would visit the temples one after another and prostrate before the deities. Then he would put on a dry, fresh cloth and sit down for japam until lunch. That is, until a little after 11. When the master's lunch was over, he would start fanning the master and would not leave the room until the master asked him to do so. After lunch, he went to the Shiva temples at the master's instructions or to some lonely place on the Ganges. And he'd do japa. Latu used to sleep a while in the afternoon. It is for this reason that Latu was rarely seen in the afternoon sessions of the assembly of devotees. A little before dusk, he would go to Holy Mother for further chores. Those finished, he would come and sit near the master. Next, he would go to the temples to see the Aratrikam. During the last few years, he would join the singing of kirtan at the Vishnu temple. Some days he would join the kirtan in the master's room. After the night meal, he would massage the master's legs and in the summer fan him for some time. When the master would fall asleep or when the master would ask him to go, he left the room. The master would direct him to some definite place in the compound of the temple for spiritual practice, and Latu used to pass the whole nights there in meditation and japa. He would return to the master's room half an hour before sunrise. Thus did our Latu pass his novitiate days happily in Dakshineswar. One of those days would be enough for most people. So, in Kasipur, when Ramakrishna had cancer, when his health was failing, Latu was he took care of his personal needs. And one day the master said to him, "Come, I have something for you." He says, "Look, this is my condition." He says, "I can't move to go to the bathroom. You take care of these things, clean them all." It was like he said, "Man, that's the best job in the world." You know, his sense of reality by that time had shifted to the spiritual. And this stuff just didn't faze him, the stuff that would be repugnant to most people. It was his joy to do this for the master. This question came up later on when Latu was seeing devotees. Different people saying different things about why the master got this illness. And they asked Latu Maharaj, why did he get this illness? And he went through this list of 7 or 8 people. Well, Naran said this, Babu said this, Rakal said this, Sarat said this, so-and-so said that. It's just very matter-of-factly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Karish Babu said this, so on and so forth. Ramakrishna himself said this. And this is the thing, he's very clear-headed. Anything he remembered, he remembered all his life. Anything he didn't pick, he was the kind of person who didn't take an interest in what he wasn't interested in. But if he took an interest in it, he really did. It's his whole mind. But Maharaj, what do you think of the matter? Why did he have this illness? Latu Maharaj. Ba. Whoever will have a body will have one day to part with it. The master also did the same thing. Very plain spoken. Ah. You idiot. The devotee proceeded. What do you say, Maharaj? Did you not feel sorrow at the master's pain? Latu Maharaj. Did the master have pain? Did he not say, let the body and its ailment come to their own terms, if they will. O my mind, you be at ease. never did I see the Master suffer when he had that illness. Sometimes he was so full of bliss that the hair on his body used to stand on end. I have seen many times that his joy overflowed on all sides, while the body was suffering terribly. When the body pain would not allow him to speak, I have seen even then he would not cease teaching us spiritual matters by pantomime. How to describe, my boy, those wonderful scenes? When some outsider would come, he would seem to be in great suffering. That very moment, if some of us, some of the direct disciples who were serving him, would enter the room, we would see him absolutely free from any pain. You just try to understand this. If the Master had real suffering, would it have been possible for the Master to infuse so much joy in us? To you, a person is nothing but the body. Therefore, when the body suffers, you say the man suffers. But it was altogether different with the Master. With him, man was the spirit within, not the body. Otherwise, do you think brothers Lauren, Kali, Tarak, who loved him so dearly, could leave him even for a moment in that condition, let alone going to Gaya to perform austerities? This is awesome. It's direct eyewitness evidence. It's so simple, it's so straight. Never did I see him suffer. Could he have given us so much joy if he himself was suffering? It was training. It brought everyone that was really close in so that he could finish his job before he left. That the Master could finish his job and train these people who were going to carry his message. Naran, Rakal, Babaram, and other disciples, in their spare time, used to sing kirtan quite loudly, and Latu would join them. One day, the Master called one of them and sarcastically said, "Well done, boys, well done. I'm dying here and you're enjoying Lord Hari's name to your heart's content." They were embarrassed. But the next moment, the Master said, explaining with love and joy, "My son, the correct tune of the song is this." Thus saying, he sang a few lines. Again, there, in this instance, you forgot this line. He sang that line also. That line should be sung in that place. The boy returned and told the brothers everything, and instantly the fervor of the kirtan increased tenfold, and they completely lost themselves in it. It's beautiful, you see? It's a lecture demonstration. In writing the memoirs of ascetic Latu, Mahendranath Datta, the brother of Swami Vivekananda, has given us a good pen picture of the wonderful transformation of the personality of Latu Maharaj at Kasipur. At Kasipur, I observed that Latu was sitting on the same carpet with the others, was talking with them on equal terms. Formerly, he used to add the honorific Babu when addressing Lauren, Rakal, and the others, who were gentlemen. Okay, and he was of a much lower class. Now he was using that he was saying to me, no Babu, to me, the intimate form of address, of equals. I gave a start when I heard him utter the word. I went on looking and observing him for some time. It took me no time to observe his total transformation. His face had changed. There was no sign of that hesitation or fear in it that I had seen before. The face was beaming with joy. There was a force and courage in his heart. In his voice there was gravity. The old life was gone, gone forever, and a new life had sprung up in its stead. And along with the new life had come a new fire in his eyes, a new mien, a new gait, in short, a new and glorified personality. It spontaneously came from my mouth. Ah, what a transformation. What happened? I don't know if I should start this now. This is his first samadhi. And then that gets into a second samadhi. I think I'll stop here. It's almost 5:30, 5:28. So I'll stop here. I'll start here in the next session. His first samadhi at Kasipur. What happened? And what was it that triggered this transformation that was we just got a pen picture of from Swami Vivekananda's brother Mahendranath. So. Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.